Ronnie Van Zant made an enemy of Mick Jagger when Lynyrd Skynyrd opened for the Rolling Stones. Jagger told them there was one thing they couldn't do, so of course Van Zant made his band members do it in the middle of the show. The soon-to-be rock legend was born in 1948 in Jacksonville. His father, Lacey, worked as a truck driver, but he hadn't always had such an innocuous career. In his youth, the elder Van Zant had spent time working as a prize fighter and made sure that all of his boys could take a punch and throw one even better. Growing up, Van Zant frequently travelled with his father while he worked, accompanying him on the road, listening to the radio and falling in love with music. At just 16, he formed a band called Us and anointed himself as the group's lead singer. Unfortunately, Us pretty quickly became I when the band broke up. Undeterred, he started another band called My Backyard with Bob Burns, Gary Rossington, Alan Collins and Larry Junstrom. They soon realised they were onto something big. Van Zant's new band consisted of musicians as young as 13, but that didn't stop them from rocking out like legends. When they weren't in school, which was a frequent occurrence, they spent every minute honing their sound. With the name change to Noble 5, they began landing gigs at local dances, accepting payment in gas money and drinks. While Van Zant and his new bandmates rocked whichever stage they were on, not everyone appreciated their sound. They did all of their rehearsals at their parents' houses, with Van Zant's booming vocals echoing through the suburban streets. They often bounced between houses based on whoever's parents would tolerate their racket. Before long, neighbours began complaining about the noise and took to calling the police to shut them up. With the help of his supportive father, Van Zant and the rest of the Noble 5 found a new place to practice and hone their sound. The band of teenage misfits moved their rehearsals to an empty house with a huge farm on the outskirts of town, which they nicknamed Hell House. Hell House was, according to the bandmates, small and hot and old, but it was theirs. Far removed from the quiet and artistic sterility of suburbia, Van Zant and the rest of the Noble 5 cranked up the volume and perfected their sound. In those early years, Van Zant and his bandmates experimented, not so much with different sounds, but with different identities. They continued booking gigs at clubs, but always performed under different names. Wildcats, the Sons of Satan, Conqueror Worm, The Pretty Ones, 1%. Finally, however, they found their true identity in one act of defiance. When they weren't rocking out in Hell House, Van Zant and his band had been stirring up trouble in school. All of the bandmates, with the exception of Collins, had attended Robert E. Lee High School. According to one former educator at the school, the dress code involved sideburns not coming below the ears, hair not touching the back of the collar, belts had to be worn, shirt tails had to be tucked in, and socks had to be worn at all times. Suffice to say, no rock and roll legend like Van Zant was going to dress like a stooge. In an effort to defy the dress code, Van Zant would put Vaseline in his hair before school to keep it off his collar. While the trick fooled most teachers into thinking that he had short hair, there was one teacher who saw straight through the ruse. According to bandmate Rossington, the gym coach would patrol the showers after class. On more than a few occasions, he caught Van Zant and his fellow rockers with their luscious locks, dripping wet and hanging well below their collar. Each infraction resulted in a trip to the principal's office and eventually suspension. Fed up with the gym teacher's constant nagging about their long hair, Rossington gave him the finger and dropped out of school. A few nights later, the band were playing a gig at the Forest Inn when Van Zant had a stroke of genius. To a crowd of mostly past or current Robert E. Lee High School students, he announced the band would be changing their name, and the inspiration for that change was their straight-laced school gym teacher, a man named Lynyrd Skynyrd. And that's how Lynyrd Skynyrd was born. With a new name and an increasingly sharp sound, VanZant and his bandmates became staples around Jacksonville. Sometime in the mid-1960s, VanZant met Nadine Insko. By January of '67, the couple had tied the knot, and within a few years had a daughter named Tammy. But his wife might not have been very supportive of his musical ambitions. Around the time that he was married, VanZant seemed to be putting his rock and roll lifestyle on hold and was working at his brother-in-law's auto parts store. But the quiet life of a family man and auto parts dealer was never going to keep VanZant interested for long, and neither was his wife. VanZant and Insko divorced in 1969, curiously right around the same time that he met Judy Seymour. A few years later, VanZant and Seymour had tied the knot and had a child. By 1970, he and his Lynyrd Skynyrd bandmates had recorded a demo, and Capricorn Records had offered them a deal. But then VanZant did something no one could believe. He turned it down. He spent the next 3 years putting in long hours with his bandmates. They performed at dive bars, often travelling for hours to go from gig to gig. Slowly, their sound began to mature, they upgraded their equipment, and they became masters of the rhythm of southern rock. VanZant, however, never felt like a true southern rock star. Even though the content of their lyrics was decidedly and distinctly southern, VanZant claimed that the Lynyrd Skynyrd sound was a bit more continental. He said that the band had modelled themselves after the British invasion bands of the 1960s. After 3 long and hard years on the road, Lynyrd Skynyrd had perfected their sound, and someone had taken notice. In 1973, MCA approached VanZant and his bandmates with a better record deal. This time, he couldn't say no. Shortly after signing the record deal, the band released their debut album. It was an instant hit and included tracks like Tuesday's Gone, Simple Man, and their signature song, Freebird, which VanZant had written the melody and lyrics for in just 3 minutes. At one performance, later released on the 1976 live album One More From the Road, VanZant asked the crowd what they wanted to hear. When the crowd shouted back Freebird, the band gave the people exactly what they had asked for, breaking into a 14-minute long rendition, cementing their place in the annals of rock history. VanZant's playful moment with the crowd turned into a kind of meme at concert performances. Decades later, when other rock legends like Nirvana and Bob Dylan asked the crowd what they wanted to hear, the crowd would shout back Freebird in tribute to Lynyrd Skynyrd.
Well, I can't Freebird, you
A stage in front of a crowd of music lovers had always felt like home to VanZant, or at least he always made himself feel at home. Famously, he never wore shoes on stage while performing. He liked to deliver his rock concerts barefoot. But don't let the long hair and bare feet confuse you. He was definitely not a hippie. In 1975, he had a run-in with the law after throwing a table out of a second-story hotel room window. But the truth was that VanZant was, in fact, almost as famous for his temper as he was for his vocals, and his bandmates knew it firsthand. Once, VanZant caught one of his bandmates drinking wine on stage during a song and punched him in the mouth. Allegedly, he did the same thing when he saw a bandmate ogling a fan. Believe it or not, but a punch to the face was VanZant's idea of going easy. By the mid-1970s, he and his bandmates had developed a reputation for being hard drinkers who loved a good fight when they weren't on stage. And when they were short on external foes, they simply fought each other, and often left their dressing rooms in shambles. Their press agent did little, if anything, to cover up their escapades, believing that it added to their mystique. But the rock and roll life was taking its toll on VanZant. By 1976, he had found himself in handcuffs more than a dozen times. Former Lynyrd Skynyrd drummer Artemis Pyle talked about the emotional roller coaster that was life with VanZant. "I loved and respected Ronnie Van Zant," he said, "but I've seen the man turn into the devil right in front of me and hurt people." Despite their rock and roll antics, VanZant and his bandmates had managed to follow up their debut album with more chart-topping hits like Sweet Home Alabama. Between 1974 and 76, they released 4 more albums, but for some bandmates, their rocket-like rise to rock star status was all a little too fast and furious, literally. In 1976, Lynyrd Skynyrd suffered 2 major setbacks. First, one of the band's guitarists, Alan Collins, fueled by alcohol, crashed his car into another parked vehicle, sending it careening across the parking lot. Then, while under the influence of drink and drugs, Rossington fell asleep at the wheel of his brand new car. As the vehicle sped along, Rossington knocked down a telephone pole, split an oak tree, and did $7,000 worth of damage to a house. His injuries were so bad that the band had to cancel their upcoming tour dates. Far from nursing his injured bandmates back to health, VanZant fined them each $5,000. In 1995, VanZant's father Lacey gave a chilling recollection of his son. He said Ronnie was the only one of his children who had second sight. He was referring, rather ominously, to the fact that VanZant had repeatedly told his friends and family members that he would not live to see his 30th birthday. He'd repeated his grim predictions so many times that his loved ones had gotten sick of hearing it. But as the date drew nearer in late 1977, VanZant's predictions became eerily accurate. On October 17th, Lynyrd Skynyrd released their album Street Survivors and prepared to go on tour. The original cover of the album depicted the band members on a city street with the buildings engulfed in flames. Just 3 days later, the album cover and all of VanZant's Prophecies took on a whole new tragic light. In the months leading up to that fateful October, Lynyrd Skynyrd's backup singer Jojo Billingsley noticed something odd about VanZant. He kept referring to himself as the Mississippi Kid, despite the fact that he had been born and raised in Florida. VanZant's only connection to Mississippi had yet to be realised. On October 20th, 1977, VanZant and his bandmates boarded a flight from South Carolina headed to their next concert in Louisiana. Somewhere outside of Gillsburg, Mississippi, VanZant's years of predictions came true. The plane ran out of fuel, and the pilot messaged the cabin telling them to brace for a crash landing. As the plane hurtled towards the ground, they struck a tree, causing VanZant to hit his head, killing him instantly. He was, as he had predicted, 29 years old, just 87 days shy of his 30th birthday. Tragically, VanZant wasn't the only member of the band to lose his life in that fateful plane crash. Guitarist and backup vocalist Steve Gaines, along with his sister and vocalist Cassie Gaines, also perished. The fortunate band members who managed to survive the crash still sustained serious injuries. Following an emotional funeral that saw attendees literally falling down from grief, VanZant's loved ones laid him to rest with his beloved fishing pole, wearing his trademark black hat. Unfortunately, in yet another twist to his story, the rock and roll legend couldn't even rest in peace, at least not for very long. In late June of 2000, vandals broke into VanZant's tomb and exhumed his body, forcing his relatives to relocate his remains. Without their lead vocalist and the heart of their band, Lynyrd Skynyrd parted ways, only coming together again a decade later, with VanZant's younger brother Johnny taking his role. VanZant sometimes performed wearing a shirt that said, "Who the f*** are the Rolling Stones anyway?" The feud goes back to when Lynyrd Skynyrd opened for the Rolling Stones at Knebworth Festival in 1976. The stage was shaped like the Rolling Stones logo, a giant mouth with its tongue out. Mick Jagger told the band that the one thing they couldn't do was perform on the iconic Rolling Stones tongue. VanZant, not one to be told what to do, ushered his bandmates out onto the tongue to play Freebird in the middle of their set. Needless to say, they never performed with Jagger or the Stones ever again. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe for more videos.